How did you find yourself at Durham? What was the journey?
So I like straight from I did my undergraduate in sport and exercise sciences at Stirling, I University of Stirling, BSc. I went into that because I like really enjoyed physiology at like I did well, advanced higher biology. Don't have higher, but that's like
Mhm.
A levels. Um and the human physiology aspect of it was that I really enjoyed. So I went there and I just kind of liked the feel of the place when I went to visit. I also applied at Dundee and Heriot Watt. So yeah, I did that, and then I did like a little research. I got a bursary in my final year to do like a summer research project to like stay and help. Um, and off the back of that, there was a PhD studentship going, and they were looking for somebody to um, do that. And I think because I'd helped out, I'd done the research project, I'd kind of given a little bit of an indication that I might be okay at what I was doing. Um, and then that's when I started my PhD. So I just went straight on to that, which was the kind of main work around the kind of 20 gram, 40 gram stuff. So I was there, did my PhD for like 3.5 years, and then a job came up at the institute that was like they were looking to like develop athlete education in nutrition, and they um they didn't actually have anyone who wasn't a dietitian at that time. They only had dietitians. I applied. My partner was working in the northeast. We met at like at uni, but he was working here, so he got a job here. He tried to find jobs in Scotland, and I'd applied for a couple, didn't get any. So I was like, it's probably only fair that I make an effort. So I applied here, Durham, Newcastle, and Northumbria, and then got an interview at Durham and got the job.
From what I gather, going straight into like a PhD style bursary, that's quite rare.
Yeah, most people would probably do masters first.
Mm.
I did. I think it was like quite a jump. Obviously, like undergraduate, you're pretty well supported. My dissertation, I did it on like fish oil and running economy. I think probably the reason that people won't necessarily go from undergraduate to PhD is because it's quite a risk in terms
Mm.
of whether they kind of got the skill set or the mentality kind of to do that and the independence. Whereas I think probably the staff at Stir, I don't think it would be as easy to do that going to a different university. But I think because people knew me, it was like a less of a risk. Um, and also maybe less of a risk than getting in somebody that you have never met before, because people can do like really well in an interview situation, but actually um I'd probably demonstrated like some of the skills that they were looking for. And it's kind of like a known quantity, isn't it? I suppose, rather than doing that. But it is reasonably um un unusual. And I think, yeah, it just a master's would like just bridge that gap of like going towards more independent study, I think. Um and I did. It was like quite pretty steep learning curve, but I was really lucky because um so Kev Tipton, who was my supervisor, he'd moved up from Birmingham with a postdoc who was Ollie Wittard. And basically he got, as part of that, quite often when you in a university you get like a bit of a package. So maybe like a PhD studentship. So he had a PhD student when he first moved, and then he got another one on a different project, and then I was kind of the third one in. So it meant when I started, I basically was like helping out on both those other projects. So by the time it came to my project, I was like pretty comfortable
Mm.
um with what I was doing because I'd seen the process, but like hadn't been needed to be responsible. So it was like quite a nice graduation of like being around and doing all the skills, but like without having that pressure. So by the time I actually did my own kind of data collection, it was kind of it was kind of like, oh, we've kind of done this before. It wasn't that scary. So that I think was a real benefit to being able to kind of do that.
What were the like key lessons you learned from, I guess, shadowing those above you? What did you take
Yeah.
into that personal project with that you wouldn't have got otherwise?
Yeah, I think, well, one, like the actual physical skills. So my kind of main PhD study was looking at kind of muscle protein synthesis. So we use like infusions of labeled amino acids. The second project that was the first one was around kind of fish oil, but looking at muscle protein synthesis. The other one was looking at kind of glucose kinetics and high fat feeding. So the first one was Chris McGlory's PhD. Second one was Sophie Wardle's. So she was looking at high fat feeding, but again using like tracers, taking muscle biopsies, taking bloods. So those kind of clinically type skills where actually I started out. I don't know if you know the process of taking a muscle biopsy, but basically there's different levels of involvement. So there's a person actually doing like the incision and like taking the muscle. There's somebody else who's basically on the other side with a big syringe that suctions. That's quite like high pressure jobs, those ones.
Yeah.
Um, and then you get the muscle and you basically clean it, and you have to kind of process it. So there's like again graduations of jobs. So it allowed me to become comfortable with all of those types of jobs.
Mm.
Um, I think the first time I saw one, I woke up, well, like I was kneeling on the floor because I think I had, like passed out. So I was like, okay. So I had to sit out in the corridor for the rest of the trial for that one. So those types of things where if that had obviously been my first one in my own project, that would have been a
Oh my.
total disaster.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
just having exposure to that and then being in the room, seeing like how it all worked together, because you've got to work really well as a team and kind of just know what everybody's roles are and how do you kind of do that, because it's a lot of it's quite timely. So like to stop them, basically to capture the muscle at that snapshot in time, you need to freeze it and you need to kind of clean it and stuff as quickly as possible. um so all of that type of stuff, and you're also taking bloods at the same time. So um like learning to cannulate and then having the opportunity to do some blood draws before I was cannulating people. So things like that where like making up the infusate, we still did that. It's much harder to do those types of things now that it's much more tightly regulated. But just those sort of actual practical skills. Um so that was one thing. And then the other thing is probably just that like the exposure to it. So it's a lot going on in a quite um not I wouldn't say it's a frantic environment, but that like it's quite high pressure environment, um, because you're dealing with like you're looking after somebody, they volunteer to do your study. There's some quite it's pretty invasive. So like it's really
Mm.
important that people know their role, do it properly, but also aren't getting in other people's way. But you've also then got to do this all with like this sort of veneer of like calm, because the participants there, as soon as anybody starts panicking, that's not
Oh,
good.
breaks loose.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes like just being able to keep calm under pressure in those situations. Quite often people would feel, even with taking blood or if there is exercise involved, we exercise to failure quite a lot. So people would feel a bit like groggy and then you're getting a muscle biopsy taken. Like so just being aware of like when somebody's about to faint, like things like that.
Mm.
So just spotting those kind of signs, but just being the extra person allowed you to do that kind of in your own time. So it wasn't, so by the time that I came to do mine, I was like pretty shit hot and everything. I knew all the roles, but that also meant that I could direct other people who were helping me. Um, and it just means that, yeah, so like teamwork communication, but like staying calm in like quite a high pressure situation. Being able to talk to people, like we had people in for like 10 hours a day, um, and like some watched films and stuff, and other people just wanted to sit there. So you just had to really talk to somebody for that amount of time. So that sounds a bit silly, but like your interpersonal skills have to be so they're like on point, because you're also trying to make people feel comfortable in a difficult situation, um, as well as calm, and like you have to kind of earn their trust because you're really kind of looking after them. So all of those types of skills that now like my interpersonal skills are one of the what like I work with people all day every day at the university in like my professional practice. So like that those are quite difficult situations to be doing that. So if you can do it in those situations, you can kind of make people feel comfortable or chat to people any in any kind of circumstances. So I would say, yeah, those are probably the kind of key things. Keeping calm under pressure, just being super organized. Like we were so everything was like planned down to like the smallest kind of detail, and then just yeah working with that kind of like getting a really good flow really, and being able to like think of all the little things. And but also if something like went wrong or something wasn't as expected or it took a little bit longer to take a blood sample, like that kind of reacting under pressure to be able to like recannulate somebody or adjust something based on the timing, and make sure we were noting all that type of stuff down, or if we didn't get enough muscle, those types of things, like just making kind of quick decisions, decisive, and then just kind of taking action. There's not really time to be like debating stuff. It's just like, yeah,
Yeah, get it done.
exactly.
It sounds like a great platform for like just being a teacher and academia in general. Obviously, besides the extracting muscle, that might not go down too well in the lecture room, but
No.
everything else sounds like yeah, like a great just platform for life in terms of the interpersonal as well as the, I guess, composure in those sorts of settings.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think sometimes when you're sometimes when you're in academia, like if you're in a group of people and everyone around you has also studied to that level, so a lot of you're surrounded by people, academics who also have got a PhD, and you think, oh God, like it can be hard to think that you're doing anything that's like above and beyond. So you can feel like
Mhm.
quite like, oh God. Whereas I probably noticed my PhD training and the resilience that you need to do to get through it, to kind of um yeah, to just the skills that you learn are actually so much more about transferable skills, um and just doing life really. Like you'd speak to your friends outside of uni or work and they'd be like, oh, it like took me ages to do it, or I'm trying to like sort, and I'm like, oh my God, just get that, like, silly like life admin stuff, and they're like faffing about like trying to do something. I'm like, oh my God, just come on. And so that level of like where you've got to operate at that slightly higher level because you're like you have to, because of the
Mm.
situations that you're in. And I can imagine it's, similar in training with other jobs where you're kind of like the stakes are quite, I mean, this is, we're not like saving people's lives and stuff, but that type of stuff where it is quite a high pressure environment, and you've kind of just got to adapt so that when you then come to like normal everyday life, that feels just a little bit easier. But the bit where you're having to adapt, that feels really hard still, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah, totally.
yeah, when you're like in that academic environment, you're not like, oh yeah, I'm killing it. Like, you just feel like everything's a bit of an uphill struggle, like you're not really succeeding at anything. But it's when you go
Mm.
back to like normal life reality, you're like, oh no, actually, I've okay, yeah, I'm
I've
operating.
learned something here.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um,
Yeah.
because I think it can, and kind of to my point earlier, by the time I would finish my PhD, I was like, I'm so for this, because it's a brutal, like, it's a brutal, I don't even know if it's an industry, but like the amount of rejection is like insane, and the amount of failure is insane through not really a lot of it's out with your control. And so I think it really kind of, it builds resilience for a reason, because you then really need it, like when you, if you continue in that role. But then when I work, like for example, when I went to the institute, people would be like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like if I did a workshop or delivered a, like designed a workshop or something, people were like, that's amazing, this is like such good. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, that's okay, do you know what I mean? That's like,
Yeah.
this, yeah, this is not me 100, like it's like,
Yeah.
glad it's
Not
good,
my
but
best.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I think that then like allows you to see the kind of comparison of the stuff that you've learned and developed, where you're like, it's all right, like it's all right, it's not my,
Mm.
yeah, I don't think it's amazing, but the fact that you do is, well, it's great. But so I
Yeah.
think that just, it gives, it's moments like that where you realize actually I've developed quite a lot of skills in a reasonably short period of time. It's only like 3 years, but it's like so it's intense.
Yeah, no, I bet it sounds it. I mean, from the very few people I know who have done PhDs, they echo the exact same thing you've said. Like, yeah, the intensity of
Mm.
the studies seem to be quite high. And as someone who's only ever done undergraduate and a dissertation, it's like, oh, how hard could it be? But then you hear people talk about it and you're like, oh my God, it is like a completely different universe in terms of the strain and I guess input that you actually have to do,
Mm,
especially when doing it alongside another full-time job. Like that sounds, yeah, it sounds heavy, very heavy. In terms of then those lessons you learned from
mm,
looking up when you were helping out and assisting, taking that into your first, well, into your PhD and your first kind of, I guess, project,
mm.
what, if any, of that experience impacted what you chose to study and how you kind of operated within that topic?
So my PhD, because it was like funded, the project was defined. So well, the first project was defined, so that was like the 20-40 grams whole body exercise um protein feeding study. So that was kind of like the main study of my PhD. But then with a PhD, you kind of need to have it needs to be like a bit of a journey as well. Um, so that was like the first part, but it was like massive because we had like 30 people, um, of 15 like high um muscle mass, 15 lower muscle mass, but like the window in the middle was basically where most people sit. So there was like a lot of screening to do, and then they had to come back for 2 visits. So in terms of like retention, I mean, I can't remember how many people I think I was on, considering I needed 15 in each group. I mean, I think I was up to like 26, 25 or 26 in terms of like participant number, even to get like full data set for 15. So it was like a bit of a mammoth study. So I felt like really comfortable with that. But then because it was a similar kind of study to what we'd done and what I'd helped with in the other project. But then just like shaping that as to like you can't just do one study for your PhD. Basically, it has to be like a program of work or kind of a series of things. So I did some additional analysis. I would say most of it's opportunity, to be honest. Like, and every PhD is a little bit different. Like some people will say, "I want to do this." And maybe they're funded and or they put in for a funding application based on their own ideas. Other people will the PhD will be advertised because it already comes with funding, which is basically what mine was. So then you kind of just have to do the project that it's on. Um, and you might then do additional studies. So I actually did a couple of additional studies. So I did some analysis on like previously collected muscle tissue using a new technique um, on the muscle that I collected, and then some additional stuff. And then we were kind of doing a little bit of work with the Scotland rugby under 20s national team. Um, so we did some DEXA scans with them, looking at body composition, and then we were also looking at their kind of food intake. So that was something that was like quite interesting for me because we're like looking right at the muscle level, like cellular kind of signaling, and then we're looking at kind of muscle protein synthesis, and then we're looking at whole muscle development, and then we're also then looking at what people are eating in real life, and in terms of um at the time, like we were saying, okay, 40 grams seems to be like more. And actually, people are eating like that's the kind of volumes that people are eating, like these players are eating post training. And we also did a comparison between like amateur players and like the Scotland team under 20s, like in terms of their diet, protein intake, dietary intake, and then their body composition. Um, and then we looked at the start and end of a Six Nations under 20s kind of campaign. So those were like opportunities that came up that we then thought actually this would be quite interesting and it would tie into the rest of the things that we're doing. So I think um, what I learned from the other kind of supporting the other projects is just kind of, yeah, I suppose looking for those opportunities, but then thinking about, okay, well, how do I answer the question? How might we design that? But a lot of the stuff that you do is, and I think in nutrition, like you've kind of got your real world questions that you're, what's happening in the real world? So what are people actually eating? What does that look like? And then what are we seeing like in an acute setting in a lab? And how does that translate and how are the two connected? So my PhD actually ended up being talking about that kind of journey, and I think it was like protein feeding, like the science behind the practice. So I really tried to like say this is what people are like in this sport, which muscle mass is quite important. these are the changes that we might see over like under 26 nations campaign. Here's the kind of muscle protein synthesis level with this level of feeding, what things look like. And then I also did like some signaling stuff as kind of, so trying to really track that journey or those different aspects through different levels of perspective, um, trying to link that kind of lab based stuff to the practice, which is kind of like set me up quite well for the institute job and is kind of underpin now where my research has kind of gone or is going.
Mm, that's super interesting. As a first study as well,
Mm,
that like sounds like such an interesting kind of path to
mm,
go down.
yeah.
Um, when you started the study,
Mm.
what were the research aims? And for those that don't know, what is protein synthesis?
Yeah, sorry, I'm using language. Protein synthesis is basically where we're building new protein. So protein is um, kind of building blocks of our muscle. They're made of protein. We eat protein in different sources. They're made up of amino acids. So proteins are kind of, from a dietary perspective, one of our kind of nutrients with that we get within our food. But then within our body, they make up all the kind of a lot of the structural bits, so like for the purposes that I'm looking at is kind of muscle protein. So that's just building of new muscle basically is muscle protein synthesis. For the study here now you're pushing me off the top of my head. So we basically I'm not going to get this word for word, but basically what we wanted to look at was there had been some research that had done a couple of studies looking at protein dose in terms of what was the kind of um, optimal or maximum dose for getting high rates of muscle protein synthesis. So how much protein did you need to eat to generate a lot of muscle or get kind of optimal muscle growth following train exercise, so weights or resistance exercise. Um, so a couple of studies had been done where they kind of said 20 grams is the kind of the dose that you need kind of post training, but both of those studies had just used the exercise, the form of exercise had just been like leg only, so
Mm.
they just basically exercise the quad muscles, so the tops of your like your thigh muscles, and we wanted to see actually whether the amount of muscle that you had meant that, so if you had more muscle, did you need to have more protein? Basically. So we did two things, which on reflection now, the question's kind of still not quite been answered, I suppose. But we wanted to know whether the amount of muscle mass you had, you needed more protein to get that kind of maximal muscle growth response. So um, that's where we had the two groups. So we had a group whose lean mass, so their muscle mass, their lean mass was over 70 kilos. So you're looking at people who are around kind of 90 to 100 kilos total, or their lean muscle mass was below 65, so lighter people. We just use men in the study actually, which was typical for its time, but is not very inclusive. Um, so we did that, and we also wanted to make it more kind of real world. So a lot of the studies previous that had looked at muscle growth do it fasted. So you basically have nothing to eat since your dinner the night before. You come in, you exercise, and then they measure the rate of muscle growth, and they give you like after your exercise they'll give you like a protein shake, and then they measure your response to that protein shake. But there's not often, and I wouldn't even recommend people to be doing fasted exercise. So we give them breakfast, so it was different to what had been done previously. And we also said how many people go to the gym and just do. I mean, there are some probably bodybuilder types out there who have a very isolated program, but for the majority of people, they're going to be doing whole body type exercises. They're going to be doing whole kind of body movements. So we also included a whole body. So we did upper body and lower body exercise. rather than just one leg, or one a part of the leg. Um, and then we had the two groups, and then we were looking at protein dose. So the first time they came in, they got either 20 grams or 40 grams post exercise, and then they came back a couple of weeks later and they got the opposite, whatever one they didn't have the first time. So yeah, we were basically looking at, if you're bigger and if you have more muscle mass, do you need more protein?
I think a lot of like the rhetoric you see online now for those that are like looking to like build body mass, there's like this idea of having like 2 grams per pound of body weight or something in
Mm.
that kind of range, that 1.7 to 2 grams. What did the study find? Was the 40 grams the optimal zone?
Yeah, so I suppose the word optimal. So we've basically found that there's a 20, we didn't find a difference between the groups, first of all. So basically when you do muscle kind of growth stuff, you measure muscle protein growth, muscle protein synthesis. And it was increased. So we didn't find any difference between the groups. So when you don't find a difference between the groups, you can collapse them. So we just looked at 20 versus 40 with everybody in the same, everybody's 20 versus everyone's 40. And the 40 grams was 20% greater in terms of that muscle protein synthesis response, which was contrary to the work that had been done previously. We speculate where it was basically 20 grams, there's no difference.
Yeah.
We we think actually that, and I think we speculate in the paper, is that to do with the whole body exercise? So you're actually exercising more muscle. So
Mm.
there's more of a kind of demand from the body. Nobody has subsequently done that type of work. So for example, doing a leg only workout versus a whole body workout with the same protein dose to see if that changes. Um, we did see that, so basically when your body doesn't use the protein, you get an increase in a waste product called urea, which you basically just pee out. So for the smaller group, we did see like a slight increase within that. Um, but yeah, muscle protein synthesis was still high. I say optimal is hard to say because 40 was our top. We just did 20 or 40. So I don't
Mhm.
know that if you didn't have 50, you would see another increase again. There will be some sort of limit ceiling based on kind of digestion and your kind of how your body handles protein. There'll be a point where more is not better, but I would say it's probably difficult to kind of say what that is. So from what we did, we could say that following whole body exercise, 40 stimulated muscle growth better than 20 grams.
Mm. Yeah. I feel like that sounds right based on like the study that's been done recently. Like there's obviously all
Mm.
this stuff now on bodybuilders and kind of specializing on how much protein's taken in. Did you look at all at was the post workout protein the same? Was it still the shake or did the
Yeah.
protein sources themselves vary?
No, so we just did 20 or 40 grams of whey protein.
Mm. Do you know if that protein source makes a difference? Obviously, not just in this study, but outside of that, does that source make any impact?
Depending on, there's been quite a bit of stuff around complete or incomplete. So whey protein and most animal proteins have like all amino acids in them.
Mm.
Um, so if you have something that's like got all of the amino acids, that seems to be kind of better. But if you're just a plant protein person, there's actually like some protein blends. So having a couple of different plant proteins, so you're picking up that amino acid profile, then seems to help a little bit. The actual form which the protein comes in. So there's some nice work from Luke Van Loon, who's based in Maastricht, where they've basically. So what we did with the protein shake and the infusion is we add basically like a labeled a tracer that's got a bit of protein. Some of the protein's got a label on it, so we can pick it up. That's how we pick it up in the muscle. So he's basically done that with cows. So what they are generating is basically tagged, and then that means that wherever it shows up in the person's body after they've consumed the milk or eaten the beef, they can see kind of where it's going. So it's like a tracking system essentially for the protein. So he's found a little bit of difference between like ground mince compared to milk. So there's difference in terms of the digestion kinetics. It kind of depends on the time frame that you look over. So
Mhm.
we looked at 3 hours and 5 hours post ingestion. So a few of the studies, for example, if you look at whey versus casein, in the first 3 hour period, it looks like whey is actually like way better for increasing muscle growth. But actually, if you look over a longer period, so over the 5 hour period, that difference kind of evens out. So it's thinking about as well what is the time frame that you're actually looking at, and if you're looking at kind of long term muscle growth building, then over that time period it kind of is kind of irrelevant how quickly it happens. um so yeah, there are differences sometimes in the form. There's also been some interesting stuff around like the combination of stuff. So I think Van Phillip was the first author. They basically looked at whole egg protein, so having whole eggs compared to egg white. And they found that the response was a little bit better with the whole egg. So having like not having just the isolated protein source. And there's some
Mm.
older research where they also did similar with milk. So they had like full fat milk versus skim milk. And the full fat milk seemed to increase muscle protein synthesis more than just the skim milk. So it's quite, there's something obviously going on there with like I don't know whether it's additional minerals, or if it's like the fat kinetics or something, or if it's the absorption, um, the rate of absorption that's maybe changed a little bit by the fat um, that's in those products. But it seems to be there's something there, but that's still like not quite. There's not been too much work like since to kind of really look at that.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting that you can track the protein through the cows.
Yeah.
That's insane. I never knew that you can do that.
Yeah, so basically, what I'm just going to turn the light on. So basically, that's how we detect it in the muscle. So what happens is when we try to explain it, once we basically infuse a tracked amino acid um into the bloodstream, and then we can see. So that's basically our amino acids are basically the building blocks of our muscles. So we've got some of those amino acids that are in that's going straight into the person's bloodstream. They're basically tagged with a label that we can then pick up in the muscle and in the blood. And then we also tag that goes into their drink. So that means that basically we can track exactly where those amino acids are going. So that's how so people ingest them. Um, they have the shake or they eat the food or whatever. And then we can follow that in the blood, so we can see the elevation of it into the blood as they digest the food or the shake. And then we can also see when it's been incorporated, when it's been used to build new muscle. And that's how we can then say the rate of that's increased. So then with the cows, what they do is they basically feed the cows the tagged amino acids and protein. Then anything that they produce, they've got that in their body, and then anything that they produce, if that's then consumed again, that tag stays on, and then you can see, okay, that those specific amino acids which are used to make proteins to build your muscle have come from the cow, so we can then see like where they end up and the rate of it. So it's really cool, like technology, like, well, yes, technology. So they were one of the first to do it in like um to have like a thickened, so to do it through the cow. But yeah, I think and his stuff's really interesting actually. I saw him present not long ago. Um and they're like PhD. I thought my PhD was stressful. They're like on a farm monitoring the cows, like taking the cow's blood to make sure that everything's okay. And
When you say tagging, what
yeah,
are they tagging it with? Like, what's the marker that you can see? And
so how's your chemistry?
GCSE, we were there. We were there for
Yeah.
GCSE.
So basically, what they do, so we usually so phenylalanine is an amino acid. It's pretty kind of stable. Um, so basically, what we do is we put so your carbon within your amino acids are usually C12.
Yep.
like in normal existence. So basically,
Yep.
how we label is that we make that slightly heavier, so it's C13.
Mhm.
So that then means that we can detect that differently to, so instead of, yeah, naturally occurring in phenylalanine is 12C for your carbon, but we have 13C phenylalanine, which is basically what we're adding. So we make that up into like saline, and that's what we then infuse. So that's infused at a rate. We know how slowly that's going in, and then we add to whatever people are ingesting as well. Sometimes you do that, sometimes you don't. So then basically what happens was then that goes into the bloodstream, and we would take like a blood sample. And then because it's slightly heavier than the naturally occurring, we can then on a mass spectrometer, that comes up basically because it's heavier, we can detect it separate to the the naturally occurring
Yeah.
12 carbon. So
Wow.
that's how we do it.
Yeah. Wow. That's super cool. That's so cool. I should have taken chemistry more seriously. I should have gone to this.
So yeah, it's really interesting. And then like the mass spectrometry is like another, if you'd asked me just when I was preparing for my Viva, I would have been able to give you a much more accurate
Mm.
answer on how that all works. But
Yeah.
so yeah, that
For next time.
basically, yeah, that you can then detect obviously the different molecular weights. So the molecular weight is slightly different with the 13, obviously, because it's slightly heavier.
Mhm.
So that's how we then differentiate, and we can then track and see based on the time of ingestion and then the amount of time that's passed um,
Yeah.
as well.
Wow. That's so cool. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm gonna have to do some more research on that on my own time after this.
And you can do it with a whole load of other. So that study that I talked about, there was Sophie's PhD. She did it, but with like glucose. So you can also label. We call it labeling. You can basically
Mm.
have like slightly heavier. So then you can then see where the glucose is going, and then that's used for a whole load of like glucose kinetics as well, which is like that's another level as well. From protein seems relatively simple compared to like glucose.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Fair. Wow. Yeah, that is really cool. That is really cool. Something else I actually came across when
Mm,
doing some research, which I didn't know too much about, if anything, to be honest, was relative energy deficiency. I
yes.
think it's REDS they're known as, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
Nice.
What are REDS and how do we see that in day to day?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so REDS is basically I would say it's a cluster of symptoms that indicate that your body's not getting enough energy for what it's doing, basically, in simple terms. So the kind of current understanding is that if we get low energy availability, so that's basically where someone is um exercising and they're not giving their body enough fuel to do the exercise, and then there'd be enough left over for our normal bodily functions. So there's basically a mismatch in that energy. So that's what we call low energy availability. And then if somebody is in that state for a long period of time or it's very severe, then we start to see what we call symptoms of REDS. It's kind of it's a interesting um there's been like a little bit of a debate as to what is it, whether it exists or not. And but like for me, working with athletes as I have and do, basically if they're not meeting their energy demands, what happens is it starts to have an impact on different body systems. So it might, for example, have a negative impact on their bone health. For females, we see like a disruption of their menstrual cycle because their body simply doesn't have enough spare energy left over from after they've done all their training to be able to do those normal bodily functions. So, but it can manifest in different ways. So typically, or in different cases, it's different for everybody. You might get disrupted kind of hormonal function. You might get impact on bone health. So that's where like if you've been suffering for quite a long time, something like a stress fracture might be kind of
Mm.
common. Um, just really poor recovery, so struggling to recover between sessions, feeling really tired. our muscle, so when we talked about muscle protein synthesis there, that actually takes like energy for our body to build new muscle, new healthy muscle. So if you've not got enough energy, then it's hard to get those like adaptations to training. So you're not really able to build muscle in the same way. Your recovery is impaired. It can have an impact on, you see people like pick up illnesses a little bit quick more often, or recurring illnesses, or it takes them a longer time to recover. um they're just like a bit, their body's just not able to kind of cope with those kind of extra demands. Their performance in training might decrease as well. They can't just kind of reach that kind of where they maybe would have before. They're just feeling like in a little bit of a hole, really. Would be my kind of simple description of it. But yeah, it's something that's it's becoming more, people are becoming more aware of it, I think. And I think there's been a little bit of a debate about what causes it, what is it really this or is it really that? But for me, like, if somebody's not eating enough to support what they're doing from a training perspective, then their body has to do something about it, really. There's not enough energy to go around. That's going to have a negative impact. So those are some of the kind of symptoms that we tend to see. um and yeah, I think just if people notice those types of things, it's good to just speak to somebody, try and get a little bit more information. There's different, there's kind of tests that people can do. It's one of those that it's really hard to get like a definitive kind of diagnosis. It's more like eliminating
Mm.
other things. But if it matches with somebody kind of not eating enough for what they're doing, and that can happen by either an increase in training volume. So often, if people are like maybe go on training camp, or they've got a change in program or a change of coach, or things change their training and they're just kind of eating the same as they were, you can get that obviously bigger change in your kind of energy, in your energy balance. Or it might be that people are eating less, or they've changed kind of what they're eating, and that could be because, like, they've got multiple say if they're a student or they're working or they're at school, and they've just got so much stuff on and they've not really got time to eat, and it's just like a bit
Mm.
chaotic. um
Yeah.
or it could be more purposeful, more intent behind it. So either they're kind of really conscious about what they're eating, maybe if they're concerned about their weight and they're trying to control that. Um, if they It might be that they just simply don't know that actually they're expending quite a lot of energy and they're not meeting those demands. There could be a whole load of things. And then also kind of disordered or eating disorders can result in that as well, if that's something that people are experiencing.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, there seems to be such a, well, greater awareness as to the physical impacts on
Mm.
mental health. Is there like a correlation between this sort of like red idea and like mental health issues, or is it purely a physical thing?
No, it's definitely mental health impacted and related. So there's nice in the kind of consensus statement that they've got from the IOC, the latest version. There's kind of a wheel, and it's got the physiological kind of, or the physical impact on health, and then there's also a performance kind of wheel. So they've kind of separated out the impact it can have on health, and then so that's kind of like bone health, menstrual health, or sorry, reproductive health, immunity, those types of things. And then you've got performance, so that's like poor muscle recovery, impaired muscle growth, those types of things. But within the health one, mood or psychological kind of impact is on there, and that's actually the only one that's kind of got a two-way arrow. So if somebody has kind of poor mental health and they're struggling with different aspects of their sport, that can actually um cause them to become, potentially kind of develop low energy availability of reds. So that would be kind of linked to more disordered eating or eating disorders, but also kind of in general. But then the other way, so if you're struggling with low energy availability, that also really affects people's kind of mood, and psychological health, because, well, there's a whole load of things. So all of those things that the kind of talked about in terms of maybe if you're seeing a decrease in your performance, you're not recovering as well, you're actually feeling tired. It can also cause sleep disturbances. Um, as well. So there's a whole load of, so it's kind of a bit of a two-way street. And there's a lot of things that are kind of playing into that. And uh, depending on the environment that people are in as well, that can also cause like stress and distress for them, depending on what that's like, if there's pressures, if and then if their body's kind of not doing what they want it to do because it doesn't have sufficient energy, that can also obviously be quite stressful too.
Yeah. If someone has listened to this and thought a lot of those symptoms align with what they have, say if they're
Mm.
like a younger athlete, or maybe like you said, like they're actively trying to lose weight or something like that, what sort of tips would you give to those people in terms of like getting back to a better place and a higher level of energy? What would be like the initial quick steps to try and improve that?
Yeah, so I would definitely just speak to some sort of medical professional if you do notice things like that, particularly if there's a change. So things that are becoming more there's actually some really nice guidance on there's a I saw it when I was prepping for a lecture the other day, Project Reds, which is like basically a group to try and raise awareness around Reds. They've done some recent videos which are really good, and it's just some athletes that kind of talk about their experiences and not really realizing like what was happening to them at the time. Um, so that's definitely kind of good to check out. But I think as well, it's just speaking to somebody, because it could be other things as well. It doesn't those symptoms aren't um kind of only related to that, but it would be definitely worth speaking to a sports type doctor if you can, somebody that you maybe, it depends on people's kind of setup and what they're in, but certainly speaking to kind of a medical professional, and just saying that potentially you think it might be this, but you've noticed these things, because it could be something else as well. So it's important, but it's obviously an indication that something's not quite right, and so there needs to be some kind of looking at it. I would also think people to just reflect on what they are eating, and if they made any changes or whatever. I think without knowing a specific somebody's specific context, it's probably difficult to kind of make what you'd say. But one of the
Mm.
biggest things to do is to just, if people are in those positions, um, would be to make sure they're increasing their intake if that is something that they think is low, which is obviously easier said than done, and that would be for people who have an eating disorder or a potential eating disorder. That's a kind of um that's a set that needs requires separate specialist treatment,
Mm.
rather than somebody who is either kind of restricting a little bit to reduce their body weight, like I said, or they're just kind of unaware of how much their body needs. But I would certainly say, yeah, if you're noticing those signs and symptoms in yourself or in somebody else, I think just having the conversation with somebody and looking at getting some, whether that's, yeah, some tests done, or um kind of just starting that process of getting support. But um if you are able to increase your intake and you think that is related to kind of a low intake, then just increasing, either adding in some extra snacks, or looking at kind of what the volume of your meals, or if there's particular nutrients that you're kind of missing out. So quite often people reduce their carbohydrate intake to because they feel like either they don't need it, or only when they're training really, really hard do they need carbohydrate. Because I think carbohydrate probably gets quite a big um there's quite a negative press still around
Mm.
carbohydrate. So just making sure that you're kind of having something before you train, having something after you train, you're kind of having you're eating regularly at kind of your main meals, and um making sure you're basically fueling your body for what you're doing. But obviously based on the specifics, it would be kind of worth speaking to somebody. I think the first thing is, though, if you do notice those things, then to kind of get support for that, rather than just not doing anything about it, because it's not something that's going to get better kind of on its own, and it probably needs further um looking at further, I think.
I initially thought about when you started speaking about this was like the idea of like the calories. when we see calories now in packets and stuff, I'm
Mm.
aware quite often of like what certain calories are in this. Do we see a big link between calories and energy in? Is it as defined as we've been told it is when we were kids, you know, calories in, calories out for like fat loss, for example? Is it like the same thing of calories in, energy in? Or is there something in that process that may change that slightly?
Yeah, so energy, I suppose when I'm talking about energy, that is essentially calories or
Mhm.
kilocalories. Um, so if you're burning, I don't know, 3,000 calories with your what it takes for your body to just keep itself alive and healthy, and then any additional training sessions that you're doing on top of that, um, then if you're eating less than that, then you're going to be in a negative energy balance. So if you're eating 2,400 calories, then you're in a 600 calorie deficit, basically. Um, so in terms of what that looks, so at a basic level, yes, that is, if you're in that level of deficit over a period of time, that's not going to be, your body's not meeting its energy needs, essentially. Within that, you've then got your kind of nutrient needs. So we would talk about our kind of main macronutrients, which basically nutrients that we need a lot of. So that's like your carbohydrate, your protein, and your fat. um, so carbohydrates basically what gives us, our bodies, the fuel to do most of the exercise that we do, generally speaking. You can use fat as well for that, but kind of having a balance of those key nutrients is important. So for example, if somebody was in an energy balance but they were having no carbohydrate, that might potentially have an impact over a longer period of time. That's still like a little bit kind of a gray area, but there seems to be like low carbohydrate availability is also, is not necessarily just about low energy availability. So um that's something that's still, there's indications that that might also have kind of an impact as well. um what I would also say is that I think people probably, when you talk to people, and just in my experience, people kind of underestimate how much your body uses. Just like if you were to just sit on the sofa all day, how much your body would actually use to do that. So we need to take that into account in addition to any then training sessions that we have. And obviously, like a lot of people have, track their um or are able to see what what their watch or their wearable or whatever is estimating their energy expenditure to be, in terms of sessions. So if you did a session that says 600 calories, but your how much your, what we call your resting metabolic rate is reasonably high as well. That's probably about 70% of how much you burn in a day. Um, so that's something that we also need to take into account, because some of the some of the emerging research around kind of what is too low, um, in terms of kind of energy levels. If you're basically on, if you're under that metabolic resting metabolic rate, that's really where it's going to start having an impact on your health. And for it's that's dependent on a whole load of things: how much muscle mass you have, your age, um, your biological sex, your height, your weight, your and then your genetics, and a whole load of things play into that. Um, so I think mine's probably around 1,400 probably. Um, so that just gives you, and I'm not that tall, I'm not a huge person. Um, so people who are bigger, who have more muscle mass, will be kind of burning more. And if you then think about how active you are or how much training you're doing, that will obviously kind of add to that as well. So if I was to then be only eating 1,000 calories a day, I'm already in a 400 calorie deficit before I even train, before I even go to work and move around and stuff. So I think it can be quite easy to kind of fall into that, in terms of like having that gap in energy balance. And our bodies, it's actually quite interesting. People who are really restricting their intake, um they're like, well, I'm not losing any weight, and it actually, what happens is your body goes into like a bit of a stressed state there, where it's not able to, it's like really kind of holding on to, um it's basically holding on to any weight that it's got. So because it's in a kind of it's holding on to those reserves. So weight loss isn't necessarily an indication of somebody not getting enough energy in as well. So that's something to think about. You might be experiencing some of those symptoms that I talked about, and you might think, well, I'm not losing any weight, so I'm fine. Or you might have gained actually a little bit of weight, and you might think, oh, that's fine. And that's where the energy in, energy out bit doesn't quite work for like weight loss, but then also kind of weight stability.
Do you think then that people are more likely undereating or overeating based on that assumption?
Well, it depends. I would say people within an athletic population, I think are probably, and that's been kind of shown they're not really kind of meeting their energy demands, or and particularly carbohydrate demands. That's been shown across a couple of different sports now. We've actually got a couple of projects that are looking at kind of meeting energy requirements and where people are at in football academy, and also women's basketball. But we're trying to take a kind of different, so we know that people kind of in those sports tend to probably undereat for what they're doing, but we're trying to understand like why is that, what's causing that. So we're just trying to take a kind of more holistic approach, and we're using kind of qualitative methods to understand what does food look like for athletes. We've got these, sport nutrition recommendations that are pretty kind of universally accepted. A lot of nutritionists would use them. They're kind of what's accepted in the literature. But we have a whole load of athletes who are kind of not meeting those recommendations. So just trying to understand that a little bit. Um, I think from like a recreational perspective, there's probably a lot of people who are under fueling. People who are less active, because we're obviously have a huge obesity crisis in the Western, in UK certainly. Um, so there are people who are definitely, I mean, over consuming. So um, yeah, I think it's difficult to have a blanket sort of we're doing one or the other, but I think there's particular populations. And I think that's sometimes where like the information that's in the general media, when it spills over into populations who are really active and exercising a lot, um that information has to change. And it's similarly like what you would have in your kind of eat well plate, your government recommendations for kind of generally active people, but not people who are, exercising where their body actually needs a little bit more. So if people are following those sort of healthy eating guidelines, which is obviously great from a health perspective, but you're actually expending, so for women the recommended for females the recommended energy intakes like from the government is like 2,000 calories, so that's just your average UK woman. For males it's 2,500. However, if you're, running 4 times a week, or, you're cycling, or you're doing whatever your sport or whatever, um, you're going to be expending an extra 700, 800, 900, however many extra calories. So, but you're following a set of guidelines that are made for a different kind of population. I think that's probably where the underfueling kind of happens, and where the gaps are. And those people are maybe, um, they wouldn't necessarily say that they're like an athlete, or they might not even compete, but actually they're the additional demand, the energy demand that they're putting on their body. Um, you need to fuel that. You need to make sure that that's being supported, and that's probably where, I think there's maybe quite a gap. So it's just making sure that people, like anybody, can be um susceptible to reds or low energy availability. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be like a professional athlete or anything like that. You could be, a recreational runner, or somebody who, yeah, just does it to keep fit, or does it for their mental health, or, you see a lot of people who exercise or are active, um, just because that's kind of part of their life. But if that's contributing to a significant amount of energy used, but that energy is then not being kind of replaced or met somewhere else, then that could potentially um, lead to kind of those things that I talked about before.
Yeah. I think you actually touched on something that I really wanted to talk about,
Mm.
which was like the kind of gym fads, maybe misinformation potentially in some respects, based on what you've said. There are two common ideas that I've been really curious about.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because as a young man, I find myself falling into these traps, especially when I was younger. I used to always undereat because like you said, with the government recommendation, I was like, all right, I have to have 2,500 calories a day, and then I would always eat less, thinking, "Oh, I've got to lose weight," but I never took into account I'm weightlifting 5 times a week, and I'm playing football on a Thursday after school, or
Yeah.
whatever that may have been, and I would have just lost. I lost all my muscle mass and not a lot of fat.
Yeah.
Um, for those then that are in this kind of limbo between like really high, like bulking season, I think it's referred to now, which is like the super high
Before
mass.
summer holidays, yeah.
Yeah. the super high, yeah, the super high like muscle building phase, and then the like super extreme fat loss phase. What would you say to people that are looking to kind of go through that gym cycle? Would there be any sort of tips, or I think maybe a better way of putting it is things to look out for in terms of health wise, particularly in terms of their long term health, things
Yeah.
that they should be careful of rather than just following what they see on Instagram?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, caveat, probably don't just follow everything that you see on Instagram. I think social media, and it's like so common. I think there's a couple of things in terms of, I'll tackle the social media bit first and then I'll come back to the advice part. I think um food is one of those things, or nutrition, because everybody eats, right? So it's something that it's not niche, it's not a niche area. Like everybody does it, everybody has to do it to survive. Therefore, there's a lot of information. Also, it means that people, it's a point of connection, it's a point of is relevant to everybody. But I also think that makes it quite susceptible to misinformation. And also because everybody eats, everybody feels that they can comment or talk about it. Whereas you wouldn't have that so much in, I'm trying to think of another, like physio, for example. You wouldn't have everybody commenting on what you should do from like a prehab perspective, or now I'm highlighting how I'm not a physio, so I wouldn't kind of know. But if you're talking about like injury management, or people wouldn't be like, feel that they would be saying, "Oh gosh, I'm not really sure about how to." I wouldn't be giving out advice on that. Whereas the same thing for nutrition, people aren't saying, I'm not qualified in that, so I'm not going to say anything." Um, I think social media as a platform, obviously, there is that platform for people to kind of communicate that. I think one of the biggest things I would say would be to look at who's given out the information and see what is their credibility like. Like, are they qualified to be giving out nutrition advice? Or, and similarly with training, are people qualified to be giving out training advice in terms of kind of programming, or what you should be doing when as well. So there's really good regulatory bodies. So for nutrition, for sport nutrition specifically, there's the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register, which is run by the British Dietetic Association. So I'm not a dietitian, which would be a clinical profession. So dietitians are clinical professions who help people with what they eat around a medical based issue. So that might be like type 1 diabetes, it might be in and around surgery, it might be like through cancer treatment, it might be through like eating disorders. I wouldn't ever treat somebody with an eating disorder. Um, but as a nutritionist, you can give out, as a sport and nutritionist, so I'm on that register, you can give out information on how to improve your or change your nutrition to support your sport and exercise. So in a kind of disease free state. So yeah, making sure that somebody's qualified. So either dietetics or sport and exercise nutritionist. There's also the Register for Nutritionists as well, which is run by the Association of Nutrition. Um, so that, and then from like a training perspective, so making sure that somebody's got like qualifications. So you've got the UK strength and conditioning, and then you've got other kind of bodies as well, bases accredited. So yeah, making sure that somebody has like some sort of qualification would be good. But yeah, I think as well, like nutrition is really personal as well. People, our bodies are all different. There are some general things that you can follow, but how one person responds to something might be really different for another person, like physiologically.
Mm.
But then also like preference and what your lifestyle's like, what else you're having to fit in, your relationship with food. Like we carry a lot of what I call food baggage. And it's when I get annoyed with people who um in like a sporting environment will make comments to an athlete about something, or will say we can't eat this, or will impose these sort of rules that are like are come from their own relationship and insecurities around food or experiences with food, and then they're imposing that on other people. And like, as somebody working in sport and as a nutritionist, I'm like really, I try really hard to be neutral about what my own beliefs are around food. Like, I really love cheese and mac and cheese, but I'm not going to tell everybody to eat mac and cheese. Or I really like, I'm not going to impose my own.
Yeah.
But that's less dangerous than people who are like, you can't eat this or you can't eat that. Their kind of own beliefs around that. So people are coming at these things with their own perspective and their own experiences, instead of maybe coming from an evidence-based perspective, and actually reflecting what the research base shows. So I think that that's also really important to think about. And I think there's a responsibility, because somebody changing their food and their diet could have like a real impact on their health. So it's not something that should be taken lightly as a kind of responsibility. But I think as well, the other thing around food, and just as humans, we like the kind of quick fixes, the sexy messaging, the like, we're very polarized in what we like. And like, nutrition and balanced nutrition is not that sexy. Like, it's like everything, like, this is such a cliche, but it's actually because it's true. Like, everything in moderation. Like, don't expect anything, don't deny yourself anything, don't like go over the top on anything, try and get lots of different food groups.
One of your five a day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Get get your 5 a day, get your, but people are like, oh my God, yawn. So that doesn't do as well on social media of me being like, you need to make sure you have a balanced diet and, eat before and
All
after.
right, all right.
Yeah, and weight loss takes like time, and changing your body
Yeah.
composition takes time, and you need to be consistent with your habits and all these types of things. People are like, "Oh my God, I want to look like that by next week." So I think there's also that is quite difficult to push against. And the nature of social media as well is the people who like shout loudest and are the most like extreme sounding tend to kind of get the most attention. So if something is sounds like either it's too good to be true, or it's like really being like pushed, I would just like avoid that. I'd be looking for kind of the balanced messages, the kind of nuanced stuff. And people saying things like, um, here's some suggestions, but be aware of your own body and how that works. I think those types of things are a good indication that somebody's um, like quite measured about their approach. So that would be social media, and in general. And I mean, social media is great for things like recipes and all those types of things, and that's fab. But, and I say to athletes I work with, like, if you want to follow that person for their food, yeah, on what they're making, but you're the judge on when's an appropriate time to have that and what you're having. And we're not listening to their advice about cutting out this or doing this or doing that. You're just like, it's a recipe and I'm going to cook the recipe, and I know that it's got this and this and this in it, so that's going to be good for me at this time. Um, in terms of the sort of gym approach of, I'm not a huge fan of like language or like bodybuilding language. I think in I've not actually worked in bodybuilding, but I think I do see that seeping out into like sports that I work in, and I have worked in, that kind of like cutting and bulking language. It's obviously very cyclical, which isn't necessarily that good for you, in terms of the the kind of ups and downs of what people are trying to achieve. Obviously, if you're trying to achieve it for kind of competition and that type of thing. But there are quite severe periods of restriction, which are not are not ideal for your body, to be honest. I think, and you know what, sometimes needs like working in doing a little bit of work in like weight making sport, and then have colleagues who work in weight making sport, and sometimes somebody just needs to make a weight for something, so they are going to have to cut back what they eat in order to do that. But it's still not super well understood what that type of behavior does from a health perspective over a long period of time. So that sort of bulking and kind of cutting, or not even bulking and cutting, but like I'm thinking of something like boxing where you're making a cut every kind of so often. There's been a little bit that's kind of looked at that, because you are going through periods there where you're inducing low energy availability for that, and you're asking your body to train. In terms of like, I would always be advocating an approach of gradual change. So I think, if you can, to be in positive, like to build muscle, you basically need to be in positive energy balance. So um the more gradually you can do that, the more likely it is you're going to put on muscle, and limit the amount of fat that you're going to be putting on. So having high protein intake, and then sufficient energy and carbohydrate to kind of build that muscle. Obviously, if you're like really tanking it and there's a big surplus, then that's where you also get the additional kind of reserves of fat. And then similarly, the other way, I mean, the extreme approach is what gets the kind of extreme look for people. So part of that will be dehydration, obviously, and part of that will be reduced carbohydrate intake. So when we store carbohydrate in our muscle, we also store water. So when you cut back those carbs, you also lose that water as well. Um, but again, keeping protein intake high and then just having a smaller energy deficit. So if I was working with somebody to either put on mass, I'd be looking at a kind of 500 calorie surplus roughly, depending on how big they are to start with, but that would be in and around. And then similarly, if I'm looking for somebody to reduce, I'd be like 300 to 500, depending on the person, what they've got on. Just trying to, yeah, keep the protein intake high, so maybe like 2 grams per kilo, a bit more, 2.3 grams per kilo. And then, yeah, kind of reducing volume of meals, probably maybe taking out a couple of snacks. So nothing extreme, nothing like, cut back and only eating like broccoli and chicken breast and that sort of thing. And I think it's also like, for me, food is so much more than just what you're like giving your body. Like, there's such a social aspect to food, there's such an enjoyment aspect to food. And I know not everybody necessarily is that bothered about food, they're not that enjoyment, but to like deprive yourself of stuff or flavor or things that you like, I think it's quite sad, and I think it does have a psychological impact. So trying to avoid things like that, or where people are like constantly thinking about food, or they're constantly weighing their food. I might, if I was working with somebody, I might get them to kind of log their food for a couple of days, just to give them where are they at. But I wouldn't be an advocate of people like tracking their intake all the time, because I think it creates this kind of over focus, and I don't think it's very good for people, kind of mentally. But I know that in some of those situations, um people do that to be kind of really accurate with what they're doing. But I wouldn't probably advise it.
Fair enough. No, Lindsay, thank you so much for your time. It's been an
No,
absolute
no
pleasure
worries.
talking to you. I can't wait to go and research how the proteins track through cows. That's going to
Yeah,
be my evening. So, yes, thank you so much. Thank you for
no
coming on. I
worries
really
at
appreciate it.
all.